For those of you that I haven't met yet before, my name is Michael Bayshard. I'm a priest of the Diocese of London, and I'm the Director of Campus Ministry here at King's University College. King's University College is situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenapeewak, and Adirondack peoples, who have long-standing relationships with the land in the region of southwestern Ontario and the City of London. The local First Nation communities of this area include the Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, and Munsee Delaware Nation. In the region, there are 11 First Nation communities and a growing Indigenous urban population. King's values the significant historical contemporary contributions of local and regional First Nations and all the original peoples of Turtle Island. We continue to ask for the Creator's blessing, that true justice and reconciliation might be brought about between Indigenous and settler communities across Canada. I'd like to welcome you this evening once again to our first lecture in the Veritas series. The Veritas series for Faith and Culture endeavors to foster learning and dialogue by gathering our community together as we seek to live lives of faith and justice. The word Veritas comes from the Latin word meaning truth. It is taken directly from the college motto, Christos est vita, veritas et via. Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. And the pursuit of truth is at the center of our mission. The theme of this year's series is renewal, and it's drawn from the prophecy of Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 40, verse 31, the prophet declares, "But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint." In the midst of the many challenges facing our nation and our communities of faith, we will be presented in this series with opportunities to consider and evaluate where we find our hope and what our direction is to be for the future. The first lecture of the year is the Principals Lecture, and it's funded by the Sisters of St. Joseph, many of whom are here with us this evening. And we thank you again and again and again for your great generosity. And the purpose of this lecture, the Principals Lecture, is to further the conversation on contemporary Indigenous issues. It is my great pleasure and my great honor this evening to introduce to you someone who really needs no introduction, Senator Murray Sinclair. As Chief Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Senator Sinclair participated in hundreds of hearings across Canada, culminating in the issuance of the TRC's report in 2015. He previously served as a judge in Manitoba from 1988 to 2009, being the first Indigenous judge appointed in his province. He has been invited to speak throughout Canada, the United States, and internationally. And in addition, Senator Sinclair has served as an adjunct professor of law at the University of Manitoba. Very active in his profession and in his community, he has won countless awards, including the National Aboriginal Achievement Award, the Manitoba Bar Association Equality Award, and the Distinguished Service Award of 2016. He was appointed to the Senate on the 2nd of April, 2016. I had the great pleasure of sitting beside the Senator this evening for supper. And it's always an incredible moment when you can be both humbled by someone's contributions to the country and then overwhelmed by the simplicity with which they present themselves and the humility that they bring to the room. It was just a gift to be there and to hear some of the stories around the TRC. Senator was saying he personally attended over 350 gatherings, listening sessions across the country. And I think we can only begin to imagine what sort of toll that would take on a person, both physically and emotionally and spiritually. And I think as a nation and as a community of nations, I'm not sure if we can ever say thank you enough for the great work that you've done. Thank you. Although the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has produced its final report, much remains to be done to ensure that all Canadians understand and implement its recommendations. So we ask ourselves this evening, what is the current state of affairs and what can we anticipate as we move forward? So once again, would you please join me in welcoming the Honorable Murray Sinclair.
Am I sounded up? Oh, here we go. All right. You have been saved one more moment. So thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you to the university for inviting me to be here, and thank you all for showing up, for being part of this this gathering, this opportunity to have a short dialogue and a process of learning about where reconciliation is. My name is Mzenegijik. They call me Murray Sinclair in the English language. But Mzenegijik is the name that I was given to recognize the work that I do, to recognize who I am and who my spirit is. It's part of the process of growing up as an Anishinaabe person, is to learn what the name of the spirit is who has come to you from the Creator. And so that's the name of the spirit who accompanies me and basically bosses me around when my wife isn't. Now, just before I came here, she called me and she said, "Make sure your hair is combed." Now, how many of you think it's combed? I'm afraid I failed on that point. Did the best I could, but the evening, we're going to spend a bit of time. I'm going to talk to you about some of the things that come to mind about the topic that I've been asked to speak to. But in addition to that, I want to talk to you about what your role in reconciliation is and what it is that we're looking for, what it is that you can do, and maybe answer some of your questions about some of those things. So hold on to your questions to the end. We'll give you an opportunity to ask them, and then we'll have a short dialogue about some of the points that we want to talk about. Now, I'm a multi-skilled talent here. Just want you to know that. So in addition to talking to you, I am also going to be running the computer that has some information on it for you. So when you see me run over there and hopefully press a button and magically something will appear, we'll have a chance to talk about that. So let me begin by, I want to play a short video for you to start with, okay? In terms of where reconciliation is, and in terms of what it is that we need to do, and why it is that we need to do some of the things that we're being called upon to do through the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as through the public discourse that's going on out there. Because this conversation around reconciliation is not a fixed conversation. It's not based upon only what we say in the report, because some of you may remember that when we delivered the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015, I said to the people who were in attendance, and there were about 3,000 people there, plus all of the people who were watching on the web stream, that we have described for you a mountain, and we have shown you the way to the top. But it is for you to do the climbing. And as you do the climbing, you will see different challenges than perhaps we have even described. Or maybe the challenges will be different than we described them. Or maybe they will be larger than you were led to believe, or smaller than you were led to believe. But reconciliation is really about you as Canadians, about us as Canadians, and what it is that we can do in order to achieve some sense of coming to terms with our past as a country. And that's what I would like to talk with you about. So, how many of you here are functional with cell phones? Good. Take them out and turn them on. Turn off the sound, but turn them on. Okay? All right? You got your cell phones on? This is unusual, incidentally. I was told that most people tell you, put your cell phones away, turn them off, and don't look at them. I'm actually going to tell you to look at your cell phones, because I want you to go to the photos on your cell phone. And I want you to look at the photos of a little girl or a little boy in your life, whether it's a child of yours or a grandchild, a granddaughter, a grandson, or a nephew, or a niece, or maybe somebody else's grandchild who you have a great deal of affection for. I want you to look at that photo. Bring it up and look at it. And then I want you to talk to the person beside you, if they don't know who that is, and tell them who that person is. So take a minute, do that. Who is that? Okay. Okay. I know now you're tempted to talk about the first time they had a bowel movement, and you're talking about all sorts of other things. But I just wanted you to introduce them. Tell them who they are in your life and why they're so close to you. Because they're your grandchild, or they're your son or your daughter at an early age. This picture here is my granddaughter, Nimijian Nibikwe. Sarah is her name in English. This picture was taken on the day we started the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. She's 6 years old in that photo. And that's about the time of life when the children were taken away from their families and placed in residential schools. So show me the pictures. Hold up your phone. Show me the pictures of the ones that you were looking at. Wow, that's long hair, eh? Oh, is that you? Wow. Who else? Show me your photos. All of you. Hold them up. Wow, this one is really cute. Oh, yeah. I can see why you love those photos. You love those children, eh? They're very close to you, right? Oh, looks like he's going to drag you down under the water. Oh, look at that. Oh, yeah, I know that photo. So, those photos that you are looking at are photos of children that touch you, that you have touched too. Remember that. These are photos of children that you have been close to, and they have been close to you, and you have learned something from them, but they are going to, if they haven't already started, to learn a lot from you. About who they are, about what they do. Our life is a challenge to help us answer 4 questions. And I say this at almost every lecture that I give, that our life is about answering 4 questions. And that first question is, where do I come from? And that question is not just about, how did I get in your tummy, Mummy? Because that's a question they always ask, right? But it's also about, where do our people come from? Who are our people? What is our creation story? How did we come to be here in this world? Where did human beings come from? It's about the beginning of life. Everybody has a creation story. Everybody probably knows the creation story in the Bible, but other cultures have other creation stories as well. And our uncle, who runs our lodge, says everybody's creation story is true. It's true because that's the story the Creator gave to you. And they're all the same. They are about how and why the Creator put you here upon this earth, in this place, at this time, so that you would be here. That question, where do I come from, is also about what happened to our people over the years. Who are my ancestors? Tell me about my ancestors. Tell me about my Uncle Charlie. Tell me about my Auntie Betsy. Tell me about what they did and why they did that. And so those stories are very important to every child. They were important to me. They're important to you. And they're important to those little children that are in your photos there. Because those little children learn about who they are partially through answering that question. This is where I come from. This is who has contributed to my life here at this time, in this place. These are the ones that I know. And that's a very important question. But also, that creation story is about the Creator. How did the Creator create this place? How did God create this place? What was His thinking when He created this place? And our teachings about that are very important because they are about faith and belief, because we can't always see those things. We can't always have that direct conversation in the same room at the same time with that person who did that. So it's about belief, it's about faith, it's about acceptance, but it's about living by the teachings that come with that story. And that's important to those little children as well. And the second question is just as important. It is about, where am I going? And that's not just about, what are we having for dinner, Mom? It's not about, what am I going to do tonight or tomorrow or next week? What university am I going to go to? What am I going to be when I grow up? It's also about what happens when I die. What happened when my grandmother died? What happened when my grandfather died? Where did they go? What happened? Explain that to me. Help me understand that. Because they need to understand that. The need to understand is very important. And every child needs to know that. And we tell them. We tell every child something that they can understand. When they're little, we'll tell them what little we think they can understand. But as they grow older, we tell them more and more, so that by the time they're an adult, they understand all about that afterlife, those afterlife teachings, because those teachings are very important, because they too are about faith, about belief, about commitment to life today, because almost all of those stories are about going to a special place. When you're finished here on this earth, you go to a special place with the Creator, or where the Creator wants you to go. And in order for that to happen, you have to live a true life. You have to live a life that is true to the teachings the Creator gave to you. You have to follow the rules of life that the Creator set out for you. You have to follow that path that you've been given. And if you know that that's at the end of it for you, then you'll be able to walk that path more easily. So that second question is very, very important. And the third question is, why am I here? Why was I born? What is my purpose in life? And that purpose in life is important for you to understand, because it's not just about doing what everybody tells you. Early on, that's what we tell the kids, do what you're told. Right? Listen to me. Do what you're told, or else. Never quite sure what or else means. I was raised in a household with 8 aunties, incidentally. They all had different interpretations of or else. Some of them more severe than others. But or else. Do what you're told or else. But it's about, why am I here? What is my purpose in life? In our teachings, Anishinaabe teachings, I told you that my name is Mzenegijik. Mzenegijik means the one who speaks of pictures in the sky. It literally means pictures in the sky. But there's a story that goes with that spirit teaching. The one who speaks of pictures in the sky is a story about a man, a young man, who goes out because he wants to help his people understand what's going on around them. Help his people understand why things are happening the way that they are, why there is turmoil, why there are problems, and what we can do about it. That name means a lot to me. It helped me understand why I should say yes when they asked me if I would become a judge. It helped me understand why I should say yes when I was asked if I would be the head of the TRC. Initially, I turned it down. They called me in 2007 and asked me if I would head the TRC. But I said, no, I'm too tired. I had just finished an inquest into the deaths of 12 babies at the Health Sciences Center. And that was a very, very hard inquiry to do, because I had to look closely at the death of each and every one of those babies, all of them under the age of 3. And no baby should die that young, particularly when their deaths were preventable. And I was not only worn out about it, but I was unnerved by it. I was shaken by it. I would go home and hug my 28-year-old daughter, and she'd say, "What's going on, Dad?" I'd say, "I love you. I love you." That's what it does to you. And it makes you understand just how fragile life is. And I needed to recuperate from that. So when they called me in 2007 and asked me if I'd do an inquiry into residential school survivor stories, I said, no. There are other people who can do it, and they'll do a good job. And I named some people who I thought could do it. And then left it at that. But then the first Truth and Reconciliation Commission set of commissioners all quit. And I knew that the survivors were really upset about that. They were not only angry at having been denied the opportunity to tell their stories, but they felt that once again they had been betrayed. And that sense of betrayal was very personal and just added to the weight and the burden of everything else that they were carrying. And I felt for them. My father had been to a residential school, and he had been abused while he was there. My aunts and uncles had been to residential school, so I understood a bit about what it was that each of them were carrying. But I had said no at the beginning because of my own sense of weakness. I didn't think I could do it right. But when they called me the second time and said, everybody wants you to do this, everybody on the team who's appointing commissioners wants you to do this, can you reconsider? And I said I would do it. And I ended up at the end of the day saying yes, because when I went into ceremony and asked, I went into sweat lodge and asked, I was reminded about my name, Mzenegijik, the one who speaks of pictures in the sky so that people will understand why. And that was important. And that's important for every single child, to be able to figure out why they're here and what it is that they can do for their children and their grandchildren and their mothers and their fathers and their aunts and their uncles and their community. We all have a huge sense of responsibility and commitment to those people who are close to us. Those little children in those photos, when you become ill, when you start to look for some answers and you start to struggle, they're the ones who are going to help you. They're going to help you because they can. And they can help you because you're teaching them how to do that. You're teaching them through your actions towards other people. You're showing them how to treat other people. And if you do that right, then when the time comes for you to call upon them, or when you need them, they'll be there for you. And that's important. It's important for them to feel that they can contribute to your comfort, to your well-being, to your happiness. And I wanted to be able to do that. And so I knew that doing the work of the TRC was important. And I set out to do it the best way that I could, in keeping with the understanding that I have about that name. And this little girl here that you see was also one of the reasons, as it was with all of my grandchildren. I wanted them all to understand that we all have that responsibility and commitment to do what we can, to make ourselves available for what it is that we do, but also to be connected to this story, because the residential school story is also about where we come from. And we need to know where we come from. And the reason we need to know is we need to understand why things are the way they are. And how are things? What's going on out there? Well, I want to show you a video. So just watch this and I'll talk about it. I hope it works. I guess I better make it bigger for those of you that need eyes.
From all graves the bones cry out. Don't let what happened to us be forgotten.
Today in Canada, of all of the men who are incarcerated in our penitentiaries and jails in Canada, about 70% in the western provinces are Aboriginal men, Indigenous men. About 90% are Indigenous women. Of all of the young people who are incarcerated in our provinces in the west, about 80% of the youth are Indigenous youth, and about 94% of the girls who are incarcerated in our youth justice system are Indigenous girls. All across the country, over half of the children who are taken into care are Indigenous kids. We represent about 5% of the total population, and yet over 53% of the young people who are taken into the child welfare system are Indigenous kids. Many of them are placed for adoptions outside of their community, outside of their families, so that their families often don't have any further connection to them. So within the family system, you can see that the impact that's going on within Indigenous communities and Indigenous families is pretty significant, pretty significantly negative. In addition to that, of course, the alcohol and drug abuse situations are quite high. Medical needs are quite significant. Community needs are quite significant. Most people are not aware, for example, that from the early part of the 19th century, 1900s, until well into the 20th century, the government of Canada refused to provide any capital resources to any Indigenous community in Canada. So in other words, you couldn't build roads, you couldn't build schools, you couldn't build pump houses unless they were government-run schools, or you couldn't build water supplies. You had to figure out a way to do that yourself. Government would not provide money for that, even though treaties were signed in which commitments were given, promises were made that were intended to ensure that Indigenous people would be able to continue to function as they had before. All of this occurred after Confederation. Before Confederation, very little in terms of negative impact on an institutional and significant scale like that had occurred. There were, of course, impacts by the very fact that there were large populations of non-Indigenous people, but at the time of Confederation, and many people are not aware of this, but I'll tell you this, the largest population of people in Canada at the time of Confederation were Indigenous people. At the European people who were in control of the government of Canada were in the minority. One other country had a very similar experience of that, and you saw what they did with it, and that was South Africa. South Africa created a system of apartheid where they denied rights to the very large population of black people. And in Canada, Canada set out to do the same thing. After Confederation, laws were passed which made it compulsory for Indigenous families to give up their children to the government so that the government could send them to schools that they had built for their so-called education. Even though, following Confederation, treaties were signed in which the government of Canada promised to build schools on the reserves of the communities that had signed the treaties. So there was a clear promise in the treaties to build a school on the reserve, but the government didn't do that. Instead, they built what they called industrial schools, built upon the model of the British industrial school system, which is schools that were intended to take in troubled youth, children who were involved with the law, children who were orphaned, and place them in those institutions so that they can be indoctrinated to become part of the working class of British society. That was the model that was used for those industrial schools after Confederation. So residential schools were created because the government recognized its obligation to build those schools on the reserve, but didn't want to do it. There's a famous quote from Sir John A. Macdonald, our first Prime Minister, who stood up in Parliament when he was asking for money to build those residential schools or those industrial schools. When he was asking for money, in order to justify it, he said, when you build schools on the reserves, the children go to school and then they come home at night and go back to their families who are savages. And they may learn to read and write, but then you will have nothing but savages who have learned to read and write. So that was his view, that Indigenous people were nothing but savages. And the common view at the time within Canadian society was that Indigenous people were savages, were heathens, were pagans, were people who were not worthy of being respected. Even though in 1763, oddly, after the French-English War, when England declared its sovereignty in North America, they issued a royal proclamation, among other things, in 1763, promising the Indigenous leaders that they would not interfere with their lands, would not interfere with their way of doing things, until they were ready to surrender their lands to the Crown. And then they could only surrender their lands to the Crown, not sell it to the privateers. That's what led to the American Revolution. American land privateers wanted that land. And so the American Revolution was funded by privateers who wanted to get out of British control so that they could get that land in their hands, which they did. But the Royal Proclamation of 1763 is significant because it was a promise that the Crown would continue to recognize Indigenous sovereignty over their territories until Indigenous people were prepared to surrender it to the Crown. And then the treaties started to flow after Confederation in 1867. And one by one, incidentally, the Canadian government was legally obligated to enter into treaties. Most people don't know that, because when the British Crown passed the British North America Act of 1867, they shortly thereafter passed the Manitoba Act of 1870 and the Rupert's Land Act, which allowed for the Hudson's Bay Company to transfer its legal interests in the territory to the Crown, which then gave it to Canada, on condition that Canada had to enter into treaties with all of the Indigenous people in the West in order to complete its sovereignty. But Canada's not done that. And Canada has not entered into treaties with even those people in the East who had sovereignty at the time. Because don't forget that Canadian sovereignty at the time was very limited to the colonies in Western and Eastern Canada. So it was a very limited jurisdictional territory that Canada actually occupied. And as it moved to the West, it was supposed to enter into treaties, legally obligated, but they didn't. And the establishment of those industrial schools following a creation of Confederation, the establishment of those industrial schools were intended to take the children away from their parents, away from their influence, away from their culture, and away from their language, and place them into centers where they could be educated. And that word is used loosely because they never really received much of an education. In fact, for the first several years that the schools were in place, they didn't learn much more than basic reading, basic writing, and some counting skills. But there was no education curriculum to speak of until the 1930s. People who worked in the schools as teachers didn't have to have any educational standards, didn't have to meet any educational standards. You didn't have to be certified as a teacher. The people who even until the last of the residential schools closed down. People who finished their education in a residential school never completed a high school education, never got a grade 12 certificate out of it. You had to go somewhere else to get your high school education because the schools were that inadequate. Though they were not about education, they were about indoctrination. They were about taking children away from their parents and placing them into institutions in which they could be taught that their people were inferior, their languages were not worthy of speaking, and in fact shouldn't be spoken. They would be punished if they spoke their language. Their cultures were not worthy of continuing, that they in fact had to learn how to do basic chore skills so that they could contribute to society in the way that commoners, common class people in England, were doing to support the rich and the elite landowners. So they were never taught skills which allowed them to do anything substantial. The Indian Act was amended, in fact, in the 1880s to say that any indigenous person, any Indian person who went to university was enfranchised. So you lost your status. You had to move off your land. You couldn't continue to maintain your status as an Indian person if you went to university. If you became a minister in a church, you lost your status. If you ran away from the schools, if your parents took you to the States, for example, to get away from the influence of these schools, which often happened, particularly in the Maritimes, where a lot of indigenous people went into Maine and Massachusetts, or in the West, where a lot of Saskatchewan people took their children down into Montana and Wyoming, and in British Columbia, where they went down into the state of Washington. People who left the country for the purpose of getting away from the schools lost their status as well. But it became an offense not to send your children to the school once the child was of an educable age, which the Indian agent solely determined. And every fall, there would be roundups in each of the community to take those children and place them in those schools. A lot has been made about the fact that a lot of abuse went on in the schools, and that's true. There's about 150,000 names that went to the schools that were listed in the settlement agreement. There were about 80,000 who were still alive at the time that the settlement agreement was reached, who signed on to the agreement. And about half of them filed claims for sexual and physical abuse. And about 30,000 of them were validated by a legal process. So that's a significant number of people who were abused in the schools. If we ran a school system in which 1/3 or more of the children in those schools were abused by the people who worked in the schools, we'd shut that system down. But the government never did. They just accepted that that was the cost of doing business and went on. So the children who went to the schools were subject to that. But even if you put that aside, every child who went to those schools was taught that their language was inferior, that they were inferior, that their cultures were inferior, and if they were not good, they couldn't go back home with their parents. They had to stay in the schools all year round. My grandmother went to a residential school when she was little. She was placed in a convent by her father, who was a Quebecer, but she tells the story when I was little. She used to talk about the fact that from the convent window, she could look over the fence, and the convent and the residential school were surrounded by the same fence. She could look over the fence and she could see her mother, who had come about 100 miles every summer, and she camped outside the gates of the convent, hoping to see her daughter, her little girl. And when her mother died, my grandmother was not allowed to go to her mother's funeral. They kept her there. So the intention was that my grandmother would become a nun. She would become one of the sisters who worked in the schools, but she chose as a young teenager that that was not the life she wanted. She didn't like that that was how she was treated. And so, in keeping with the practice of the times, she waited for one of the students or one of the men who came to the school from time to time looking for a wife, to be picked to become somebody's wife. But she chose not to become a member of the church in that way, not to become a sister or a nun. But that was her choice. She was never abused in the school, other than the fact that she was never allowed to see her mother, never allowed to see her father. And that's a form of abuse if you think about it. If you think about those children that are in those phones that you showed me, those pictures, think about how they would feel if they could never see you again. If somebody from the government came and took them away from you, and they were told they could never see you again. Think of the devastating effect that would have upon them. Even though they may be living with somebody who's taking good care of them, maybe showing them even some affection. But there's always some part of you that wonders, what's my mother doing today? And what made it even worse for my grandmother was, there she was, just on the other side of the fence, camping there, cooking there, watching the gate, hoping that her daughter would come out and see her. And she never did. Terrible dilemma for her. And all of those children who were placed in those schools suffered from the fact that they were taught that they were inferior. They were taught that they were inferior to the European children who lived just across the road sometimes, or who lived in the same community as they did. And what made it even worse was that the children, the indigenous kids who were sent to public schools, were taught the same thing, indirectly, sometimes directly. I remember when I went to school in the 50s, in the 60s, all of the stories about anything positive to do with Canadian history were always about colonialism, were always about Europeans, the European heroes. It's always about Jacques Cartier, Samuel de Champlain, all of those guys, usually men, of course, but all of the wonderful things they did to make this country the great country that it is today. But not one story was ever told about the indigenous people, unless it was a negative story. I can still remember in grade 9 being in a history class where they talked about the burning at the stake of 2 priests and their hearts being taken out, and those savage Indians and what they did, and that was terrible. And I remember the shame that I felt. I remember thinking, that's my people who did that, and that's not right. They shouldn't have done that. And they shouldn't have done that. But it happened. And that's the only story that we were told. Even in the media, go to the movies, John Wayne movies. Right? There was never an Indian John Wayne couldn't kill, and he often killed many of them with one shot. They all fell off their horses whenever he came into town. But the media portrayed us in the same way. It gave us the same impression about who we were. It unvalidated us. And we weren't taught the answers to that first question. Where do I come from? I had no idea about where our people came from until I went to university and I actually researched it. And then I found out about how we were part of Treaty 1 and who our leaders were at that time and what they said. And I went into the archives and saw all of those documents and decided that that's a story that needed to be told. Because we have so much that we can do, so much better than we could be, not only as indigenous people, but as a country as well. And we weren't allowed to do that. I remember in the 60s, during the civil rights movement in the United States, Martin Luther King was the big figurehead of the civil rights movement in the United States. There were others, of course, Malcolm X and others, but Martin Luther King was the guy. And I remember him saying in a speech that was played over and over again, that when you start out behind in the race, the only way to win is for you to run faster than the man ahead of you. So you have an obligation as black people in the United States to compete with the white man, but you have to compete better than he is. You have to be better than he is at what he's doing. And that became sort of the mantra around the civil rights movement, not only in the United States, but in Canada. And I heard many Indigenous leaders say, our success, our path to success is for us to beat the white man at his own game, to be better at law, to be better politicians, to be better teachers, to be better at everything. And I believe that. I believe that. And I lived my life in high school that way. And I excelled at that. I was a top student. I graduated at the top of my class. I was a valedictorian of my high school when I graduated. I was the athlete of the year when I graduated. I went on to law school, graduated from law. I won awards when I was in law school, and I was a good lawyer. But after 1 year of practicing law, I decided to quit. I said, I can't do this anymore, because this system is all screwed up. It's hurting us. It's continuing to hurt us. And so my wife said, before you make any decisions, go talk to one of our elders. And so there was a man I knew who had worked in the court system who I really had a lot of respect for, a lot of love for him. And so I went to see him. His name was Angus Merrick. I went to see Angus and I said, Angus, I need to talk to you. And he said, come on in. Early in the morning, we sat in his teepee in his backyard, a little fire going in the middle. I brought him a pack of cigarettes. We drank a lot of tea that day. He smoked all those cigarettes while he listened to my grievance, and I told him my frustrations, how the day that I first appeared in court to represent a guy, my first appearance in court, I walked in, I had a brand new suit on, I had a Samsonite briefcase that was still shiny, it was so new. Probably still had plastic on the edges. May even have had a price tag hanging off of it, which my kids will tell you I still do, wear price tags. But I walked into that courtroom, and they called my client's name, and I walked up to the table where the lawyers were standing. I put my briefcase on the table, and I stood there, and the judge was looking down, and he said, well, Mr. Smith. He looked up at me and he said, so what are you charged with today? He didn't even though I had a really nice suit on, he only ever saw me as an accused. And things didn't get much better after that. They didn't get much better. I had judges who would say to me when I was arguing for a lawyer, or arguing for a client, and I was their lawyer, I had judges who would say to me, it's about time that those people learn to respect the law. Well, I'm going to make an example of your client, he would say. And I heard that many times. So after a year of putting up with that, I said, I've got to quit. I can't do this. I can't be part of a system that does this. Now, when I talked to Angus about those frustrations and those feelings, I said, I'm going to leave the practice of law and I'm going to quit. I said, my grandfather was a carpenter. He was a good carpenter. He taught me how to do work with wood. I'm going to go do that. And so after I had finished speaking, Angus said to me, well, he said, if you want, you can quit. Nothing's stopping you. You have the right to do that. You want to be a carpenter? He said, you go be a carpenter. You'll be a good carpenter. He said, you're a smart man. You'll be a good carpenter. He said, you'll probably be the only carpenter that knows law. But he said, you know, because of that, people are still going to come to you when they have a problem. And they're still going to ask you what you think. They're going to ask you for help. And what are you going to do then when they ask you for help, even if you're a carpenter? He said, you could be a good lawyer. You could be a judge, and you'll be a good judge, he said. This was long before I was even appointed as a judge. He said, but your problem is not that you're not good at what it is that you do. The problem is that you're not good at being who you are at what you do. And I said, what does that mean? He said, it's because you don't know what it means to be an Anishinaabe. You don't know how to be a lawyer who knows Anishinaabe law. You don't know how to be the best lawyer that you can be because you are not yet the best human that you can be. And you can't be the best human that you can be until you know all those teachings that go with life. You need to learn how to be a good son, he said to your father. You need to learn how to be a good brother to your sister and your brother. You need to learn how to be a good grandson to your grandparents. You need to learn how to be a good uncle. You need to learn how to be a good father when you have children. You need to learn how to be a good grandfather. And then you'll figure out how to be a good lawyer. But when you do figure that all out, he said, then you will be the kind of lawyer the Creator wanted you to be. He wanted you to be a good lawyer. He wanted you to be the lawyer that you could be. Because that's why this has happened, he said. This has all happened in this way, and you are here at this time because you have a role to play in all of this. And you have to figure out what that is. And that's when I realized that that mantra from the civil rights movement was not our mantra. It was not for us to be better at what the white man did than what he did. It was for us to be the best that we could be at doing those kinds of things. Our obligation was to be the best human being possible. And we had the means to do that. And we had to find the ones who could help us answer those questions. And residential schools stopped all of those children from learning that. That was the real damage from residential schools. It wasn't just the abuse. The abuse happened because one individual did something wrong to one child at a particular point in time, or maybe more than one child. It wasn't about what the system did to that child in that way, but what the system did to those children overall was to prevent them from learning those answers that they needed to know. And any educational system that prevents you from learning the answers to those questions is a system that is an abusive system, because it's designed to take you away from your culture, to take you away from your past and your future, and your present, because your communities suffer from your inabilities as well. So as a result, the work that I did with the residential school survivors was all about giving them an opportunity to voice their frustrations and their feelings around that. And their thought that this was something that needed to be said. And they needed to say it, and we gave them that opportunity. But I think any success that comes out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is not about the individual stories and what happens as a result of the individual stories. It's about the collective of those stories and what comes from that. It's about what is it that we can learn from that, and what is it that we can do about that. Because remember this, while that was being done to indigenous kids in residential schools, it was also being done to indigenous kids in public schools, as it had been done to me. But the silent message was that right beside me were the guys I played basketball with in high school, non-indigenous kids. And they were being taught the very same thing, which is that my people were inferior to their people, and that they were superior to me. I went back to my high school reunion one time, because remember I was a valedictorian, so they keep inviting me back. I keep turning them down, but finally on the 25th anniversary, I decided to go. And they invited me to speak, and I said, you know, the one truth about our relationship is that I didn't realize it at the time, but now I realize that when I was being recognized by all of you in the way that I was recognized at that time, not one of you would have traded places with me. Not one of you would have wanted to be in my shoes. Not one of you would have wanted to be Anishinaabe, because you always saw us as being inferior people. I haven't gotten an invitation yet for a while, so maybe it hit too close to home. But that's true, you know. All of you who have been educated in Canada, and even those of you who've been educated in other countries, have all been taught that Indigenous people were inferior, but you've also been perhaps quietly told that European people who came here were superior to Indigenous people. That's why the doctrine of discovery still has such a strong hold on our thinking, that somehow European nations could come here and say, this is our land now. Sorry, people who are here. We discovered it, so we're taking it over. Doctrine of discovery. It still hasn't been ruled illegal by any court in Canada. It will be, perhaps someday, maybe not quite yet, because it has such a strong hold on our thinking. We haven't figured out how to justify European sovereignty in this territory, or Canadian sovereignty, without relying upon those racist concepts. And that's what it is, really. We have a long way to go when it comes to that. But at the same time, we have a population of young Indigenous people who are now going to university, who are getting an education, who know their teachings, who know where they come from, who know what their elders have taught them, who know who they are, who know what it means to be Anishinaabe, to be Innu, to be Mohawk. They have that knowledge, and they're going to try to make it work. So the time for confrontation is approaching us, that we better figure out how to deal with this before it becomes too critical. Because it will become critical. This is not going to go away. This history is not simply going to stay in the past. One of the elders who was an advisor of ours during the TRC, often said to us, remember, you may be able to get past your history. You may be able to be finished with your history, but your history will never be finished with you. So you have to figure out how to come to terms with all of this. And we have a lot of work to do about that. And I want you to watch another video, because I want you to see what young people today are saying about what's important to them. You may think that now they're focusing on becoming educators, becoming lawyers, becoming judges, becoming politicians, becoming engineers. But at its very root, this is what's important. So listen carefully to what these young people are saying, if you don't mind.
We
blood flows deep. Take a breath and make it last. Take a peek, but don't you cry from what you see. Are you scared underneath what is buried inside me? The scars we bear. Find your friends, find the clues, lead you back to who you are. Your roots are calling, whispered softly. You are found where you belong. Come and find me, come and find me. 'Cause I've been hiding, I've been hiding. If you feel alone or if your language is gone, it's up to you to see what's hidden or lost. Sing, come this way. Pagpasa akla. Look for your spirit. Kunutawaguse. You know there's a story beneath your feet. On this sacred land, we're playing hide and seek.
Tired of feeling invisible and being ignored. Been living a nightmare, I'm dreaming for more. Seeking a place where I'm safe, I'm seeing the storms. I'm sick and tired of this hiding behind locked doors.
From a dark past, and every lie I've heard has made my people much stronger from the grind and hurt. Now I'm looking for direction, let me find the current. There is reconciliation every time we learn.
My sole intent is to find a little OCM from the leaders of man, cause we're a ghost to them. Trying to spread truth, even to my closest friends. I'm not alone, my culture's what my home defends. This ain't a game to lose, we need to trace our roots. Embrace the truth, is what I came to do. The high suicide rates, the face the youth make me afraid. But listen, don't be ashamed of you.
Come and find me, come and find me. 'Cause I've been hiding, I've been hiding. If you feel alone or if your language is gone, it's up to you to see what's hidden or lost. Sing, come this way. The closer you look, the more that you see. The wisdom of elders come back to me. Once taken from home, but now we are free. We won't forget where we're meant to be. Come and find me, come and find me. 'Cause I've been hiding, I've been hiding. If you feel alone or if your language is gone, it's up to you to see what's hidden or lost. Sing, come this way. Pagpasa akla. Look for your spirit. Kunutawaguse. You know there's a story beneath your feet. On this sacred land, we're playing hide and seek.
I may not have to explain that to you, but it's about the voices of the ancestors talking to the children of today. Come and find me. I have something to give you. And their answer to that is, now that I know, I'll come and find you. So we're running out of time here, so I wanted to talk just a little bit about the fact that where reconciliation now is. We're barely off the starting line, okay? I want you to know that. We're not even close to addressing what it is that we mean by reconciliation. But I'll tell you this much. Reconciliation, according to the work that we did, we defined reconciliation as the establishment of a respectful relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in this country. So mutual respect is what we called for reconciliation to focus upon as we move forward. And those of you who were watching the election, that's going on now, the federal election, and saw the provincial election, or see the way governments across Canada are behaving, you'll know that we're not there yet. You'll know that there's a lot of negativity that's being thought, being said, being written about Indigenous people, about victims, missing and murdered Indigenous women inquiry report. A lot of things that are being said that are not contributing to a mutually respectful relationship because we're not there yet. Education is the key to reconciliation. We need to begin by talking to our children about this history and teaching them what it is that they must learn from this so that they will not continue to repeat the mistakes of what it is that we are doing today. Education is very important. But before we can establish a relationship of mutual respect, we need to understand something very, very important. And that is that, as these young people in this song told us, what is most important to them right now is self-respect. They need to know who they are. They need to know why they are. They need to know where they come from. Not only the bad stuff, they need to know all of those good things too about the past. They need to know where they're going. They need to know why they're here. And by doing that, they will be able to answer that fourth question, which is, who am I? Who am I? And who are we? And so, before we can have mutual respect, we need to ensure that we do everything we can so that Indigenous children today will be able to gain self-respect. They will be able to be shown how to ignore those things of the past that have weighed us down, how to overcome the shame of the past teachings. We need to look at our books that we use for our children, at the movies, the songs that we sing, all of those things. And we need to challenge them. We need to challenge language. We need to challenge thinking. And that's where you come in. You need to talk to people when you hear them talking in a way that is denigrating to others. You need to be the one to challenge. You want to make reconciliation happen? Concentrate on one person, on one thing, on one event, and correct it and fix it. If you do that, you will make this a better place. And reconciliation, in the way that we thought it would and could and should be, will come about. But we have a long way to go. Reconciliation in terms of mutual respect between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people is not going to happen in my lifetime. It will not happen in your lifetime either. But if we work at it, if we ensure that our children are educated, it will come about eventually. But along the way, we're going to have lots of fights. Reconciliation is much harder to get to than the truth was. But think of reconciliation in terms of this relationship in the same way that you would think about it in terms of a marital relationship, right? Even when you get there, you still better work at it. And you see all the older married couples saying, yep. Just this morning, he did this, right? My wife will tell you about those kind of things all the time. But you have to be prepared to continue to work at that and to understand your obligation to make it happen. I talk to young people all the time, and I say to them, and I've done marriages with young people, and I say to the young men when I'm performing, before I perform the marriage, I said, your obligation as a young husband is to do something every day to make your wife fall in love with you. Do something every day that makes your wife fall in love with you. If you do that, then everything will work out. If we do that, and everything will work out. Miigwech. Thank you. I don't know. Don't come and use mine, okay?
So we're very lucky to have the senator with us. I think that we have time for a very few questions, and I think just to give some guidance around that, there's a mic at the back of the room that we'd ask you to use. I talked with the senator ahead of time. He said a good thing is if someone doesn't ask a question within 30 seconds of starting to speak, we're going to cut them off, okay? So it's not a time just to come and say things, it's a time to really take advantage of the fact that we have the senator with us today. So please do, I think we have time, to respect your time, I think we have time for about maybe 5 questions, depending on how it goes. So the mic is right by where Father Michael is standing.
Father Mike has a mic.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for your talk. It was very informative. I'd like to know, do the Indigenous students still have to give up their status if they attend university?
No.
And when did that happen?
The amendment occurred in 1953, I believe. It was the early 50s. Yeah. The reason is because the government was encouraging Indigenous people to move off the reserves and move into communities. So one of the ways of doing that was to encourage them to attend post-secondary institutions. So they amended the Indian Act in 1953, I think, to do away with that prohibition. There was a series of amendments also that were intended to make it comply with the UN Convention on Genocide. And the UN Convention on Genocide specifically said any nation's action, any government action, which has the impact of taking you away from your culture, is an act of genocide. And so, in compliance with that, they amended the Indian Act significantly in the 1950s.
Thank you.
The second song that you played, do you have the name of the artist? Was the title "Come and Find Me"?
It's actually a series. So thank you for asking that question, incidentally, because there's a series of them. Nuejanon, it's on the screen, and I'll share it with the organizers so you can get it. But they did a whole series of community events, community activities where they went from one community to the other, working with young people to get them to talk about how this history, as they had come to learn it, could be worked into music, because music is an incredible means of expression. And this particular song is one that they shared with me at the beginning of their work, and so I said I'm going to share it with everybody. It's on YouTube, incidentally, if you ever go on YouTube.
I'll look for it. Thank you.
N-W-A-J-I-N-A-A-N. Just YouTube that. Is that the expression? I don't know. Google that. I always think Googling is such a dirty word. I don't know why. I can't get past that. Don't you dare Google me. Yes.
Good evening. I've enjoyed your time here, Murray, and I am also a survivor, residential school, 4 years in Mohawk Institute. And my story has not been heard. I was in a class action lawsuit for 11 years, and it still hasn't been heard. Our lawyer went out west to the settlement conference, and he told us here in London that if any survivors were at the table, Canada wouldn't sit down. And that was a lie. And my whole file is with Wally McKay. I'm sure you know Wally.
I know Wally, yep.
And he refuses to give it back. And I don't know why. Isidore Day has tried. I've spoken over in Mercury Day. I've spoken to Phil Fontaine. He said, Bill, you were supposed to be there. You weren't there. You were the leverage of this whole settlement. We were told we can't.
So why don't you come and talk to me, and
I would
figure
love
out
to, if
I'll
I-
figure out how to help you. Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
All right.
I wish to thank you also for this evening. We've heard a lot about the truth of the situation. And in the reconciliation part, has there ever been a chance or a time when people who have been perpetrators and people who are victims actually get together and talk without the word you used, a confrontation? Like, is there any time that will happen or has happened, like it has in South Africa? I know it was more of a court setting where they actually got together and a lot of tears but sometimes I think the talking between those two parties is important.
It is, and there have been during the process of the TRC, we had a few of those kinds of events happen, where victim and perpetrator came together, often accidentally, almost without planning, and talked and shared, and they had a moment of reconciliation among them, between them, and so that was beautiful to behold. But also, most of the events that called for the inclusion or the involvement of perpetrators would have been events that occurred in the last part of the schools, because most of the perpetrators would have long since died by the 1960s or 1950s, because the events that occurred from about 1960 on, there would have still been some perpetrators and some victims still around, but they weren't allowed to testify before us. They had to go to the claims process and testify in front of adjudicators and tell their stories there, and that was considered to be a closed process. We have tried to get a hold of those transcripts, and they're still being withheld by the government, and my view has always been that they should be retained under seal for a certain period of time, but then they should be opened up for research, because they will be invaluable in terms of understanding what went on between people and why. But the other thing is that most of the perpetrators during that process were being advised by lawyers not to say anything publicly and not to participate in a public process. And so even though we invited perpetrators to come forward and talk, we were not successful in getting very many of them to come. And in our process, we were told specifically to tell the survivors that they were legally not allowed to name their perpetrator during their testimony, if the perpetrator was still alive. So that was also a prohibition. So the process itself was a flawed process. There's no question to that. It was a successful process in many respects, but in that way it was not a successful process, because we did not have an opportunity to bring perpetrator and survivor together. And I think it probably would have been difficult to do without a lot more time and a lot more support on both sides, because we know that in many cases the perpetrators and the victims were Indigenous people. Often towards the end of the residential schools, perpetrators were other school students who had learned their behavior from their own experience at the hands of their perpetrators, and were then inflicting that abuse on other people in the schools. And so it's a complex process, a complex question, but it's a good question, but The important thing for you to understand is that it would not have been easy in that particular environment to do that, and in that particular time frame. We only had 5 years, and it would have taken a lot longer. And I'll tell you that we spoke to the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission people about their process and how they involved. They did not hear from anywhere near the number of people that we did. And they only brought together people, perpetrator and victim, in a limited number of cases. They didn't do it for everybody. And they were intended, in doing that, their intention was to highlight how reconciliation could work between people. So we heard from, we recorded more than 6,000, I think, statements from survivors, but they didn't record anywhere near that number. So,
Thank you.
all right.
We'll just take three
Good
more
evening,
questions.
Senator. Thank you for your talk. Very good. We have a long ways to go, as you mentioned, with reconciliation. Where does the Indian Act fit into that, or does not fit into that path ahead?
How many of you think we should do away with the Indian Act? Right? Well, it's pretty unanimous, actually, pretty significant. How many of you think we should keep the Indian Act? I don't see one hand going up. Oh, you do. Okay, good. Well, somebody's there in favor of it, but most people agree that the Indian Act should be done away with. The real question is, what do we replace it with? That's the question. And that's where we can't agree. What kind of relationship do we want to put into law? And how do we want to define? Because, you know, I'll tell you quite frankly, the legislation that we need is legislation to prevent the government from doing things. So we need more controls on government than we do on Indigenous people.
Just a quick follow-up. So do you see self-governance across the country with many of the First Nations as a result of that possibility?
Well, we see various, there's probably, I can't remember the count now, I seem to, the number 23 sticks in my head, pieces of legislation that allow Indigenous communities to have their own form of government. So there's various Indigenous government acts all around Canada. So they're getting out of the Indian Act, but through other pieces of legislation. But again, the hallmark of all of those pieces of legislation is the amount of control that the Canadian government has upon their lives. There is no law which says, as the Royal Proclamation of 1763 said, you can keep doing things the way you want, and we won't interfere. So,
Thank you.
what we need is a non-governmental interference act. I'm not sure what the time is, Father. 2 more? Okay.
Sagoli, lodliwa jene ni, nawani wa kitalonda, wanya da agani wa gohonjoda. Hasni wa sajada ni wa gosliago. Ne wagatsanoni ji aska segung ne awasundat. My name's Luke. You know me. I revere you as Uncle Murray. The senator piece is like something for out there. But uncle is the of the.
Oh no, let's keep it.
I say that, and of course I say that with all due respect. But as a Haudenosaunee, as a person who has been here, who lives under the laws and the protection of the great law of peace, it's hard to see a reconciliation where the state. I love fellow Canadians, great relationship, but the state of Canada is the part where I have a problem with. And with the current political climate, and with Andrew Scheer saying things like First Nations should not be allowed to hold these pipelines and projects hostage, what is your view on where this is? And I'm sorry, I'm late so maybe you've talked about this already, so I apologize. But where are we going with that? I mean, like, there's a lot of hostility, there's a lot of anger and frustration from our side, saying, you know, enough is enough.
Yeah, I gave the complete answer right at the beginning, so I'm sorry. Before I forget, I want to pick up on something you said, and that is that I have a niece who's just graduating just graduated from law school last year, and when she was going to law school, she called me up and said, "Uncle, I'm going to go to law school." And so I said, "That's great, my girl." And as she was going through, we would talk about what she was learning, and she said, at one point in her third year of law, she said, "I've decided I'm not going to go into litigation. I'm not going to go to court as a lawyer." And I said, "Well, that's too bad. That's where we really need people." She said, "Yeah, because if I ever appeared in front of you, I'd have to say, 'The Honorable Mr. Justice Uncle Murray.'" That doesn't sound right. But the question that you're asking I think it's a developing question, actually, because I think when you think about that question in a few months from now, or maybe next year at this time, you'll think of it in a different way. Because the relationship between the government and Indigenous people and Indigenous rights generally is changing. Reconciliation in Canada has been led by the courts, and I think the courts have yet to pronounce upon the legal relationship, and the legal relationship influences the economic and the political relationship significantly. So I think we're probably going to see some significant changes in that respect. But the short answer to your question is that the people who speak about that, particularly from the non-Indigenous side, are coming from a history of being taught that Indigenous people have no rights, that Indigenous people basically are Canadians with a different color skin, and that they have to do what they're told like everybody else. And we're going to tell them what to do. And so until we can get people out of that mindset, we're always going to have that conflict. So I don't see these things changing very quickly. I think we're going to have that kind of conflict for a while yet. And incidentally, I'm not picking on the Conservatives about that. The Liberals are the very same way. Right? I mean, who buys a pipeline and then declares that they're in favor of environmental protection? Yep.
So Goli, what kanu hela do? Wa kunini ang yats onya daag o ni wagahot. Hello.
Hello.
My name is Hallie. My spirit name is Wakwini. It means she looks nice. She dresses nice. Everything about her is nice.
There you go.
Well, I have a question for you.
Yep.
In two parts. First part, can I get my picture taken with you? And second part.
Why not? 1,000 others are going to do it later tonight. So.
Second part, can I also give you a hug?
Okay. That's a good way to end the questions, right? Okay. Up here. Come on, no. You can't hug me from down there. Come on. Get up here. All right. Okay, here we go. All right. Don't you dare tell my wife that happened. And don't you, okay?
That's okay.
Lips are sealed, right? Facebook does not exist in our house, so. All right, I think that's it. Again, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
So friends, just as we start to conclude our evening, we do have some thanks to offer, but joining us now after participating in Take Back the Night, which also is happening tonight, we welcome the Warrior Women of Positive Drum, who will offer thanks and send us forward, I think, with courage to embrace the work that we all must continue. So please attend.
Are you going to kill this mic? All right, thanks. You won't hear me singing.
Saguli sogwing, ganizla ni get sa nawal ni magita lora, oni daag ni ko ni hudrot, sorry. We're very honored to be asked to come sing here, and it was truly an honor just to listen to the words that were spoken tonight. So tonight we're going to sing the traveling song, because if we want to send everybody out in a good way and surround you with love and light and a good journey home. So yeah.
And I would say last but not least, but I'm going to invite forward Sister Kathleen Lichty of the Sisters of St. Joseph to offer a final word of thanks. Senator? Senator? Yeah.
It's so nice to have the last word again. I feel almost disrespectful when I say Murray. Senator Murray Sinclair. It is education that got us into this mess. I don't know if you use the word mess, but it is a mess. And it is education that is going to get us out of it. We need to be educated that we are not superior. You don't need to be educated. Non-Indigenous people need to know they are not inferior. We all need to know we are part of the human race. And I thank you tonight for bringing us to our knees. Those of us who are settlers in shame, in guilt, in anger, but also wanting to work together as members of the human race. And I can't thank you enough. I think that's the sentiments of this group.
So, thank you to the Senator Ed, that a video capturing tonight's event will be available online if you wish to share that, and probably within a couple of weeks. Do take our brochure while you're here. In October, we will welcome Father James Martin, who will present on showing respect and welcome to LGBTQ people in the church. Please also remember there's a donation box that we use to support the work of welcoming refugees and continuing all that we do here at King's. So thank you so much for coming. Please drive safely. Tell a friend. Thank you. Thank you.